Imagine a scientist walked up to you and confidently claimed they knew exactly where your ancestors lived 300,000 years ago. At first, that sounds impossible because nobody witnessed those events, and no written records existed to preserve humanity's earliest history. There were no cameras, no civilizations recording birds, and no maps showing where the first humans began their journey. So how could modern scientists possibly know where our species first appeared after hundreds of thousands of years have passed? Yet today, scientists are remarkably confident that every person alive can trace their ancestry back to a population that lived in Africa. That conclusion wasn't reached through guesswork, tradition, or a single remarkable discovery hidden inside an ancient archaeological site. Instead, the strongest evidence is something you carry inside nearly every cell of your body every single day. That evidence is your DNA, and it has become one of the most powerful tools for understanding human history. This immediately raises an obvious question because DNA doesn't survive forever and every living organism eventually dies. If DNA slowly breaks apart after death, how could it possibly reveal events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago? The answer is both surprisingly simple and incredibly fascinating because scientists are not following ancient DNA molecules themselves. Instead, they are following the information that DNA carries as it passes continuously from one generation to the next. By the end of this video, you'll understand how that information survives through time and why it provides overwhelming evidence that humans first evolved in Africa. Let's begin by clearing up one of the biggest misconceptions about how genetic research actually works. Many people imagine scientists discovered perfectly preserved DNA from someone who lived 300,000 years ago and simply analyzed it. Although that would certainly make life easier, the reality is much more complicated because DNA begins breaking down soon after an organism dies. Heat, water, oxygen, and countless microorganisms slowly damage DNA until the original molecule eventually disappears completely. Under exceptionally rare conditions, such as permanently frozen ground or extremely dry caves, scientists can sometimes recover DNA that is tens of thousands of years old. Those rare discoveries have allowed researchers to study ancient relatives like Neanderthals and Denisovans in remarkable detail. However, recovering usable DNA from humans who lived around 300,000 years ago is almost impossible with today's technology. So if the original DNA molecules no longer exist, where does all the evidence actually come from? The answer completely changes the way most people think about genetics. Because DNA molecules disappear, but genetic information continues to survive. Imagine your grandmother writes down her favorite family recipe and later copies it for your mother before the original paper is lost. Years later, your mother carefully copies the same recipe for you, and eventually you copy it for your own children. After many generations, every original piece of paper may have disappeared, yet the recipe itself still survives unchanged. The paper was never the important part because the valuable information continued moving from one person to the next. DNA works in almost exactly the same way because every generation receives a newly copied version of the previous generation's genetic instructions. The original DNA molecule never survives for hundreds of thousands of years, but its information continues through an uninterrupted chain of reproduction. Now think about your own family, because every person alive today is part of that same continuous chain stretching back through history. You inherited roughly half of your DNA from your mother, while the other half came from your father through the same process. Each of your parents inherited their DNA from their own parents, who received theirs from the generations before them. If you continue following that chain backward, every generation eventually connects to the earliest members of our species. Scientists estimate that an average human generation lasts about 25 years, although it naturally varies throughout history. That means traveling back roughly 300,000 years takes us through approximately 12,000 consecutive generations of human reproduction. The DNA inside your body is therefore the result of nearly 12,000 continuous copying events that never completely stopped. Not a single DNA molecule survived that entire journey because every generation simply created a fresh copy for the next. That incredible chain of uninterrupted copying is the real reason scientists can study humanity's deep past without needing perfectly preserved ancient DNA. Now, another fascinating question naturally appears because copying something thousands of times usually creates countless mistakes along the way. So why hasn't our genetic information become completely corrupted after 12,000 generations of continuous copying? The answer reveals one of biology's most extraordinary achievements, and it explains why DNA is such a reliable historical record. The answer begins with one remarkable fact, because DNA copying is far more accurate than most people ever imagine. Every human genome contains more than 3 billion genetic letters that must be copied whenever a new generation begins. That number is so enormous that it becomes difficult to appreciate without comparing it to something much more familiar. Imagine walking into a library containing a single book filled with more than 3 billion individual letters. Now imagine someone asking you to copy every page, every sentence, and every letter without making significant mistakes. Most people would expect thousands of errors because even copying a short paragraph perfectly can be surprisingly difficult. Yet your cells perform an even more demanding task every time a new human life begins. On average, each generation introduces only about 50 to 100 new mutations across all 3 billion genetic letters. That accuracy is astonishing because it means almost the entire genetic instruction manual is copied correctly every generation. This happens because our cells constantly proofread DNA, repairing damaged sections before they become permanent changes. Without these repair systems, harmful mistakes would accumulate rapidly, making complex life almost impossible to sustain. However, the small number of mutations that escape those repairs become incredibly valuable to genetic researchers. Those tiny changes act like historical timestamps, allowing scientists to compare different populations across thousands of generations. Now, another important question naturally appears because billions of people have reproduced throughout human history. Shouldn't 12,000 generations of reproduction have completely mixed everyone's DNA into one indistinguishable genetic pattern? At first glance, that seems perfectly reasonable because DNA is constantly passed between parents and their children. The surprising answer is that our DNA becomes mixed continuously, but it never becomes completely uniform. Imagine you have two decks of playing cards representing the DNA inherited from each of your parents. Before passing those cards to your child, you shuffle both decks together into one completely new combination. Your child later repeats exactly the same process with another person's shuffled deck of genetic information. This reshuffling happens during every generation, creating a unique genetic combination for every individual who has ever lived. That is why brothers and sisters usually share many similarities while still remaining genetically different from one another. Now imagine this reshuffling process repeating continuously across thousands of generations and billions of individual human lives. Although DNA keeps mixing, something unexpected also happens because not every piece survives indefinitely through future generations. Imagine your great-great-grandmother possessed one small genetic variation that only some of her descendants inherited. As generations continue passing, reshuffling, and recombining DNA, fewer descendants continue carrying that particular genetic sequence. Eventually, that specific piece of DNA may disappear completely from your own branch of the family tree. This means many people who are unquestionably your ancestors contributed no detectable DNA to you today. That idea sounds almost impossible because we naturally assume every ancestor leaves something behind inside our genome. In reality, inheritance works more like probability than permanent storage because DNA is constantly reshuffled and occasionally lost. This discovery leads scientists to distinguish between two completely different kinds of ancestors found within every family history. The first type is called a genealogical ancestor, meaning someone who appears somewhere within your family tree. The second type is called a genetic ancestor, meaning someone whose DNA still exists inside your body today. Although these definitions sound similar, they describe two very different aspects of your ancestry. Every genetic ancestor is also a genealogical ancestor, but the reverse is not always true. Imagine tracing your family tree back approximately 30 generations into the distant human past. Mathematically, your family tree would contain more than 1 billion ancestral positions before accounting for overlapping relatives. Of course, many ancestors appear multiple times because distant relatives sometimes had children together throughout history. Even after considering those overlaps, your family tree still expands much faster than your genome ever can. Your DNA remains roughly the same size throughout your entire lifetime, regardless of how large your family tree becomes. Eventually, many ancestors remain permanently recorded in your genealogy while contributing no measurable DNA to your genome. This constant balance between inheritance, reshuffling, and loss explains why DNA preserves history without preserving every individual ancestor. It also prepares us to answer the biggest question of this entire video, because the same principles explain humanity's African origin. Now, we finally have everything we need to answer the original question about humanity's birthplace. Imagine the very first population of modern humans living together in one region of Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. Generation after generation, tiny mutations naturally appeared as DNA was copied from parents to their children. Most of those mutations had little or no effect, but they quietly accumulated over thousands of generations. As families grew and spread across Africa, different groups gradually developed their own unique combinations of genetic variations. By the time time humans began leaving Africa, the population already contained an enormous amount of genetic diversity. Now imagine that only a relatively small group decided to leave and explore entirely new parts of the world. That small group carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity that already existed within the larger African population. Think of it like taking a few chapters from an enormous encyclopedia instead of carrying the entire collection. Those chapters still contain valuable information, but they cannot possibly include everything found in the complete encyclopedia. As humans spread into Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, each population continued following its own evolutionary path. New mutations slowly appeared within those populations, creating additional differences as thousands of years continued to pass. However, every one of those populations still originated from the smaller group that first left Africa. This means every non-African population inherited only part of the original genetic variation present within Africa. Now imagine scientists collecting DNA samples from millions of people living across every continent on Earth. Instead of searching for one special gene, researchers compare millions of tiny genetic differences throughout entire human genomes. The pattern they discover is remarkably consistent regardless of which population they study. African populations contain the greatest amount of genetic diversity found anywhere in the world today. Every population outside Africa contains only a subset of that original diversity carried by the people who migrated. If humans had first evolved somewhere else, scientists would expect to find the greatest genetic diversity in that location instead. Instead, every large-scale genetic study continues pointing back toward Africa as humanity's oldest known home. By itself, that evidence is already extremely persuasive, but science becomes even stronger when completely independent evidence agrees. DNA is not telling this story alone because several other scientific fields reached the same conclusion independently. The fossil record provides one of the strongest examples because the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils have all been discovered in Africa. Archaeology reaches the same conclusion because the earliest evidence of modern human behavior also appears there first. Ancient DNA adds another important piece because humans later interbred with Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia after leaving Africa. Even geography supports this history because the timing and locations of human migrations match the genetic evidence remarkably well. When genetics, fossils, archaeology, and geography all reach the same conclusion independently, scientists become much more confident they have reconstructed the correct history. Speaking of fossils, you might wonder how scientists know whether one is thousands or even millions of years old. I've already made a video explaining the dating techniques scientists use, including radiocarbon dating, radioactive isotopes, and several other fascinating methods. If you want to understand the fossil evidence even better, be sure to watch that video after finishing this one. So how do we know humans evolved in Africa? Not because one extraordinary fossil answered every question scientists had about our origins. Not because a perfectly preserved DNA sample survived for hundreds of thousands of years. We know because every generation faithfully copied genetic information into the next while tiny changes accumulated over time. Some of those changes disappeared forever, while others spread through populations and remain visible inside our DNA today. By comparing those countless tiny differences across billions of genetic letters, scientists can reconstruct events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's one of the greatest detective stories in human history because every person alive carries a small piece of the evidence. The remarkable part is that you don't need to visit a museum or an archaeological site to see that evidence. Every cell inside your body already contains a tiny record of humanity's extraordinary journey across our planet. If you enjoy exploring the science behind humanity, evolution, history, and the universe, consider subscribing for more videos like this. Every week, we'll uncover another mystery by following the evidence, asking better questions, and discovering how science reveals the incredible story of our world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.